the things, but they're not in the PowerPoint, so I'll kind of get through the PowerPoint first, I think, and then just look at some of the documents. So a few things just by way of intro. Community forest, we're an area-based tenure, meaning we have the exclusive right to harvest inside the tenure area that we have. It's not a volume-based tenure like a lot of other tenures in the Powell River Forest District, where there are no defined, this is interforest and nobody else's, and this is A&A's and nobody else's. They kind of share the broader landscape. In an area-based tenure, the community forest is the only timber harvester allowed within that area. Our tenure area is 10,794 hectares, 6,205 hectares is the net timber harvesting land base. So you can see there's about 4,600 cubic meters that is netted out for a variety of reasons, be it old growth management areas, be it wildlife habitat areas for other species, be it riparian, be it low productivity sites, a variety of things. Our annual allowable cut is 20,000 cubic meters a year, and we have an H-class distribution issue in the community forest. It's been there since we were awarded the tenure. We're our first 20 years. There's H-class issues, and I'll show you a graph of that. And but a key thing that I focus on from a forester point of view is harvesting the profile, the species mix that we have, and not necessarily chasing just the blocks that can make money, but when markets are right, I make a point of going in to deal with species that have lower value traditionally, but there's times when it's the right time to go get them, and that certainly plays in on this one. Just by comparison, we've often been compared to Powell River. Powell River Community Forest is 6,200 hectares versus our 10,700. They've got a higher AAC, 25,000 a year, and they've just bumped it up to 34,000. Annual allowable cut. That's their annual harvest that they're allowed. 80% of their tenure is in their community watershed. There's a fish hatchery downstream as well. They lucked out a bit. They had a lot of engineering done when they first started, but like I say, their cut's now up to 34,000. Net downs in our area, as I mentioned, inoperable areas, low volume, non-productive sites, environmentally sensitive areas, terrain and soil issues, slope stability issues, low timber value stands, where very low volume per hectares, where you've already got built roads, trails, openings, etc. Cultural areas, riparian zones, integrated watershed management plans or watershed issues, old growth management areas, or OGMAs as they're called, or wildlife habitat areas, in this case for marbled murrelets, seabird. Now this one's a little tough to see, but it just gives you a little bit of an idea on the left there, some of the issues in terms of and how it impacts us. From the point of what I've got here is if in our total area of 10,790, if the Chapman watershed from the intake up is completely taken out, we reduce the area by 4,952, we're down to 5,585. And if we take the Grey Creek out as well, we're down to 3,782 out of that 10,790. I mentioned H-class distribution being an issue. In this case, these traditionally are the ages that we harvest in this range here. We haven't harvested any old growth in the community forest since it started. We've got an awful lot of young stands coming online over the next 20 to 40 years. A significant amount of the area that was put into our tenure had been previously harvested in the last 20 to 40 years. And that's why we've got as much of those young stands coming on. But typically we're operating in this area in here. And when you look at that and a 20-year plan, and certainly not all of that, depending on where it is and how it's grouped or whatever, from an economic point of view, might be a bit more difficult.
And the two colors, the CFLB and THLB, means?
The green is the non-timber harvesting land base. So these are areas that are not part of the timber harvesting. So that's going to be your OGMAs and a variety of other things. So we're only operating with the lime green on the bottom. The dark green on the top is not something I have access to based on the net downs that I showed you. We have 3 areas in the community forest. We have this is the Chapman, the Gray, and the Angus, and the Brunette. So Gray Creek is to the left. The intake is just down here. This is Gray Creek and the upper reaches of the watershed up here. Edwards Lake, which comes down from Chapman, or just over from Chapman. Edwards can flow into Gray or into Chapman, and usually it's going into Chapman, especially in low flow periods, or lower flow. Chapman Creek is this portion over in here and down in here. We haven't harvested anything out of the Chapman since the community forest came in. We agreed up front to a 25-year moratorium on that. Gray Creek in October of 2010, previous council put a 5-year moratorium on any operations in the Gray Creek. We haven't, that's expired now, but we haven't done any planning or anything in there. Angus Brunette is the area down at the bottom in here. This is Hidden Grove and the Sechelt Heritage Forest in here, just by way of, and Sandy Hook, Tawanik out at the end here. This is the Half Moon Bay or West Sechelt tenure. For reference, this is Wormy Lake here, Crowston Lake here, and Trout Lake here, so this is the highway. And this is the power line corridor and pipeline corridor that goes through. West Sechelt, just down over in here. The areas that you see on these, all of the colored areas are part of the net downs. So when I mentioned all the areas that net down from the gross area to a timber harvesting land base that we can operate on, all those colored areas are areas that are already netted out for any one of those reasons that I've already given, be it low productivity, be it old growth, be it ungulate winter range, or not ungulate winter range, WHAs, wildlife habitat areas for mirrelets, that kind of thing. And then the other one is Wilson Creek. So by way of reference, Field Road is here, the airport is right here, power line corridor, pipeline corridor coming up through here. This area right here is the provincial park, Elphinstone Provincial Park, and our cut block would be right in here, East Wilson 28, and 23 is further over. One of the things that sometimes hear comment on in the paper is just how many jobs do we support? You know, whether it's you know, a few people for a few weeks or whatever else. When I go through our work and the things that people that physically touch our wood or come on into our cut blocks or handle our wood in some way, shape, or form. When you look at the engineering planning, I'll start up at the top here. Engineering, planning, GIS, silviculture, planning, 7 people, all contractors. Fallers, 4 to 5 fallers are in a cut block typically. Road construction crew is typically 3. Logging crew, at least 3 to 4 in addition to the fallers. Log trucks and low beds, another 5. Freight, typically if we're bringing culverts, if we're purchasing culverts or moving things around on the coast here, we hire local trucking to do that. Bush scaling, there's a number of scaling tasks that we do out in the bush where if we're doing house logs, if we're doing poles for outside sales, those are typically scaled at roadside where we bring a scaler up from one of the dryland sorts and do that work at roadside. We scale it, we tag it, we truck it out and put it in the water and house sound, or if it's house logs, we go to West Coast Log Homes. Local mills, 3 West Coast Log Homes. Back then, when I first put this together, they had 16 employees. They're more than double that now. They've gotten quite busy. Local firewood sellers, we typically haven't sold wood to firewood sellers in the past just because there's a pretty significant public demand. This year, there was an even greater demand, and there are a lot of people out there who can't get out themselves to get firewood on their own. They're getting old. They're just not capable of going out and cutting. So we did sell some wood to 3 local firewood cutters this year. Coastland dryland sort, typically 27 people are working down there. When we started up last spring with the fire block, their entire crew was laid off, and when our wood came in, that was what brought them back to work after a winter shutdown for them. Scaling and computing off coast, but typically once the scalers have finished all their work and they download it, there's 2 other people in Vancouver that go through and do all the computing and put the boom compilations together and all the daily numbers, submit the scale summaries to Victoria, to the harvest billing system, that kind of stuff. We have another individual who does all our waste surveys for us. Log marketing, I haven't included the entire group, but our log broker, there's typically would be 4 people that are quite involved in dealing with our wood. Ministry of Forest staff, 2 typically between C&E and if whether I'm talking to someone, there's obviously a lot of people, or a lot more people than that in the office up there. BC Hydro and Fortis, typically if we're working near power lines, if we're going over a pipeline, we have to bring people out. They have to do, you know, see how deep it is top dead center over the pipeline to see whether we can actually travel over the pipe, whether we've got to build a bridge over it, whether we can do other things, but they have to come out, survey it. BC Hydro, safe distance from power lines. People have to come out and evaluate, work with us. We might have to send fallers up to do pruning on trees, that kind of thing, to deal with any power line corridors that might be near a cut block, or that might be impacted by a cut block away from the power line, but it might change things around the power line. We've had to do that a number of times and put fallers up to prune or top or fall trees. Professional terrain, hydrologists, fish and wildlife people. Typically we're anywhere up to 5, depending on the work that we're doing. Terrain could be terrain stability, terrain classification work, hydrologists or geotechs, geoscientists to do a variety of things, be it watershed assessments or otherwise. Sechelt Indian Band Archaeological Rights and Title Department. Typically there's at least 4 people there that we're dealing with. The ARC assessments that are done on every cut block that we propose, there's usually at least 2 or 3 people out in the field doing that work. When we do our planting or spacing or fertilization, typically there's 4 to 6 people doing that work. Sometimes it's different crews, not the same crew, but typically there's 4 to 6 people out there when we're doing the work. Accounting and audits, we have our accountant here in town who does our statements, and then we have auditors in Vancouver that do our audited financial statements for year end. Staff, there's 2 of us, Linda and I. And road grading, we've got a contractor here in the coast who does our road grading for us. So adds up to 107. Some of those jobs are going to last typically anywhere up to 5 to 6 months to harvest our wood in a given season. Others might be a few days and everything else in between. But it's the only 2 that we would not pay directly and write a check to pay would be Ministry of Forest staff or BC Hydro and Fortis. Everybody else that's in there are being paid to do the work that they do for us. So there's a lot of people. For a cut our size, that's significant. It's not a few for a few weeks. Logging the species and the profile, logging the species profile, I mentioned earlier, it's an important factor. There's been lots of examples where licensees, and I won't name any, but licensees typically will chase the highest value first, always, be it cedar. There's certainly areas up in the Kinkom, the Mid-Coast, North Island, where you have more cedar dominant stands where, and where hemlock might be of lower quality, and companies will focus on the cedar. And there's certainly a lot of criticism goes to those folks. You're basically logging the best block you can, and then you move down to the next best, and the next, and the next, and the next, and eventually what's left isn't that pretty and not very economically viable after a significant period of time. I try and work ours so that I'm not, for example, logging cedar blocks in the peak of the cedar market, because cedar typically is a fairly valuable species no matter what the market's doing. I can make money on it whether it's a low cedar market or a high one. But it's typically hemlock is the one that I have a tougher time making money on. East Wilson 28 is 45% hemlock. So that is the key reason the hemlock pricing today is the best it's been for at least the last 5 to 6 years. And that's why it's on the list. I would have logged it last year, but we were delayed a year in the fire block. And so we did the fire block last year because we had a lot of insect issues with grubs specifically, and also concerns with Douglas fir bark beetle and other things. But grubs were doing significant damage. We were delayed more than a year before we could get started on that, and the insect damage was really starting to get into the wood. So that became the focus last year instead of logging these blocks. These blocks were in permit last November. We could have gone on them, but we did the fire block first. The other part is I do rotate between the three areas, those three geographical areas. Typically, we do block in Half Moon Bay, blocks in the Angus Brunette area, and then blocks in the Wilson Creek area. Then we shift back out to Half Moon Bay, and we just rotate around as opposed to doing something in one area every year or whatever. The last block we did in Wilson was in 2013, 2012, 2013. So like I say, the plan had been to, we would have been in there in 15, 16, and we didn't because of the fire block. We're in year 3 of our 5-year cut control. We're currently at 37,000 cubic meters harvested. With the 2 blocks that we're proposing now, one in Wilson, one in Half Moon Bay, that's another 23. We'll be at 60,000 and be on target for 60,000 after 3 years at 20,000 a year. East Wilson 28, we engineered it in the spring of 2014. The first feedback we got from ELF was in January of 2015, almost 3 years ago. Issues raised with chanterelles initially and old growth. For those of you that are mushroom pickers, chanterelles are pretty abundant on the coast. They're quite prevalent. Certainly one of the most abundant and plentiful of the edible mushrooms, and a very popular one. And East Wilson 28 is a second growth stand. It's 130 to 135-year-old with vets, and the vets are not harvested. Roosevelt elk was next issue on the critical winter range. I'll get into the elk a little bit more after this, but elk are abundant and plentiful on the Sunshine Coast. This particular block is in the rain zone. Typically you have the rain zone, the rain on snow, the snow zone, and then heavy snowpack zone. 0 to 300 meters is the rain zone. And if you look at not only the Ministry of Environment's deer and elk management guidebooks and the research that's done in the 0 to 300 range, typically ungulate winter range is not nearly as important, in some cases not even necessary, and it becomes more of an issue in the higher, the 3 to 900, which is the rain on snow zone, or sometimes the 4 to 900, depending on the aspects you're working on. In this particular case, we're on kind of a southeast to southwest aspect, meaning that's the direction that it flows. So when there's more sunlight on a southeast to southwest slope. If it was on the north side, it would be a lot colder. There'd be more snow. There'd be more issues. The snowpack would go lower down the hills. But on the southeast to southwest.
Apologies for the construction zone.
Yeah.
We decided to do the roof in the winter. So.
Just as an example, I mean, I've lived here since 1994, and I've shoveled my driveway once in the winter of 1996 at Christmas time. So it's red-legged frogs. There was a mistake made in our bid package. Red-legged frogs and western toads were found in block 23, not in block 28. And we've dealt with it in block 23, but they were not found in block 28. And I'll show you the field work that was done on that. And CP9 was issued, as I mentioned, in November of 2016. So there are some chanterelles. For those of you that aren't mushroom pickers, that's what they look like. My wife and I go out every year picking mushrooms. Chanterelles are certainly one of our favorites. Cauliflower mushrooms when we can find them as well. She knows more about which ones you can eat and which ones you can't, but I do like these guys. Elk, this picture was taken up in Chapman Creek when Glynis Harrell did the watershed assessment for Chapman and Gray. It's a wetland area. This is Chapman Creek here. It's below the lake where it swings down. It's better than halfway up. It's up into, this is an old growth stand, and you can see the elk scattered all through this wetland area. They're just literally laying down in amongst the sedges and the weeds in this wetland area. Quite popular for them. I think there's 10 or 12 in there. It's quite common that you find them up there in the summertime. Red-legged frogs, that's what the critters look like. Their legs really are red. Not a particularly big frog, but I've certainly seen lots of them around here on the coast, but they are a listed species. They were an S4 and they were dropped down into an S3, S4, I believe, so it's now blue listed. Information required in the referrals. I mentioned the attachments, the stream classification work, fish presence or absence, listed species presence, listed species meaning under BC legislation. I mean, you've got the federal legislation with species at risk, the Species at Risk Act. In BC, we also have listed species, and then we have what we call the Identified Wildlife Management Strategy. And that includes both plants and animals, amphibians, fish, whatever, but it's kind of all classifications. There's currently 85 species or plant groups on that list, and where they occur, we do work on setting aside habitat for those known and listed species. We also have to do visual assessments, visual quality assessments or visual impact assessments in order to meet visual quality objectives set by government. And each forest district is different, but this district does have them. And we do archaeological assessments. I shouldn't say we do, the band does them. Their crew goes out, they do the work. We simply send them block maps. They go out and do the work and send us reports based on what they find. This is the block. Actually, I'll put this one up here first. This just kind of puts it in perspective. So the airport, as I mentioned before, the airport's just down here. This is the power line, Field Road up to the top. Then you swing out and come up. This is the cut block here. Mount Elphinstone Provincial Park here. Our tenure boundary is this line here and over here. Chapman Creek is off in this corner. The last block we harvested in here was East Wilson 2, down in here. If you look at the cut block itself, it's approximately 19 hectares that's going to be harvested. This area here is a wildlife tree retention area, and these are two other retention areas that we've put into the block. When you look at it from the point of the surrounding area, this is a park, this is an old growth management area, this is an old growth management area, old growth management area, old growth management area. This area here, East Wilson 2, when it was initially put in permit, this entire area right down to our tenure boundary, this is private land under here, Island Timberlands, all along the bottom here. This entire area was actually in the cutting permit, and that permit was put in place prior to my joining the community forest. And when I went in and walked this area, I chose not to harvest this area down in here. There was a combination of reasons, one being it did provide some additional connectivity, but there was other factors. There were some soil issues that I wasn't comfortable with down in this area, and I chose to leave it. And in looking at all of this area here, as well as a number of other areas around, other areas over here, significant and very good winter cover for ungulates. There, in my opinion, is not a shortage. I have been out with an elk biologist that I've known for almost 40 years now, who works on the coast, primarily grizzlies, elk, marbled murrelets, as well as some other stuff. She had collars on grizzly bears back in the 70s up in the mid-coast and was tracking them annually by helicopter and whatnot. She's been in the game for an awful long time.
Can I just ask a question about
Yes.
that map? So if you're, the areas in white, right beside EW,
These?
those,
Yep.
those are, you said old growth protected?
Old growth management areas, yes.
Okay.
And that's the park up here.
Okay.
That's another OGMOP at the top.
So then you left the section right along the bottom from EW.
Down here?
Sure,
Yeah.
yeah, you left that, so that connects with two old growth management areas.
Yep.
Doesn't seem to be a connection further to the right between those two old growth
No,
management
this
areas.
this was a much younger stand.
Okay.
It's probably 25 years old. It was previously harvested. You can kind of tell from the shade there, previously harvested.
So then we go back towards 28. The
Yep.
part in the light green is going to be left, so that
Yep,
extends.
that's a wildlife tree retention area.
That
Yep.
extends the old growth management area into a wildlife extension area, if I can. How, any potential of connecting to the next old growth management?
There's riparian reserve zones that are left outside of the cut block in here for connectivity up in here. The other part is even this strip down in here was initially not put in an OGMA. When we put the falling boundary in here, it didn't go right to the OGMA boundary, so there's additional area in here as well. This area in here is second growth.
But there are some riparians?
These are, oh, absolutely.
And how wide would they be?
Wilson Creek is a fish stream.
Okay.
So we've left, I believe it's 20 meters.
So Wilson Creek runs through that long finger of old growth
Wilson
management
Creek
area?
comes down here. East Wilson Creek is over here. Yeah. Wilson Creek comes over here and comes down and tags in down below here in Island Timberlands property. Okay. When you look at landscape unit, landscape unit boundaries, the Powell River Forest District has 24 landscape units. Our tenure is in the Sechelt landscape unit and the Chapman landscape unit. Chapman basically covers all of Grey Creek, Chapman, and comes down to Witherby Point, down in Howe Sound, if you're familiar with the area down there. On the way down to the pulp mill, but Witherby Point is just past where Sechelt Creek have their dryland sort. We have tenure on both sides. In the 24, one of the things that they do, they break them down. In every forest district, they have these landscape units, and it's typically an order of magnitude around 25 that they take a forest district and split it up into. And they're kind of natural areas, be it different watersheds within the area. And then they do what they call a biodiversity emphasis analysis on each one. And they want to have high biodiversity emphasis ones, medium ones, and low. Typically, and this is true in the Powell River one, the ones where people live, where the highest population centers are, which is in our case, the Chapman and the Sechelt. That's where most of the people live in here. Not many people live down in Howe Sound past the pulp mill, or all up the inlets and whatever else. And the other, so these two are low biodiversity emphasis, and Texada and Lois and Haslam in here, which is where Powell River is. They are also low biodiversity emphasis areas. And then you start moving into the medium biodiversity emphasis, places like Hamathco, Southgate, Toba, Brem are high biodiversity emphasis. And you typically are going to find more of the big mammal species up in there. I was surprised the Bishop wasn't, but it's totally isolated. There's no roads whatsoever into the Bishop. But all of those, large grizzly populations, moose, now they're getting elk in as well. But big mammals, big predators, typically are more in those more remote areas. Although we now have some grizzlies down on the Sunshine Coast here, on the peninsula, sorry, wrong one. Let's just get into elk a little bit. If you go back to 1986-87, they brought 24 elk over to the coast here, and they landed them on Sechelt Peninsula. Basically, elk were extirpated from this area back in approximately 1900, or very early 1900s. Combination of reasons, but one that some people felt certainly contributed to it was that they allowed elk to be a market meat, meaning you could shoot an elk and sell the meat in a butcher shop. Typically you can't do that today, but back then you could. And it's a big animal, and the meat was very popular. It's still popular today. But that was a big factor in why the herds were hit as hard as they were. And they didn't obviously have the controls that they do now with the hunting and fishing regulations. Since 1986, when we had our initial animals brought over from Vancouver Island and put on the Sechelt Peninsula, after a number of years, our herd grew very quickly and very successfully. And then Darrell Reynolds started transplanting, and the first transplants went up into the Lois area, up in here, Stillwater area. Our 24 has now grown into, with 60 transplants since 1986, 87. That herd has now grown into 1,643 animals just on the lower mainland here. And that's been the sole source of all those transplants. And we still have over 200 here on the peninsula. There's now, I believe, 10 or 12, and I'll get into this a little bit more, but there's now hunting seasons on over half of the areas that they've transplanted elk into, because the herds have reached either target population levels or higher. They start moving them out once they get close to the carrying capacity. But once they have a target level, then they start allowing hunting. And Darrell Reynolds has been quite vocal and quite open about the fact that they are bringing elk back so they can harvest them. It's not just so that people can go and look at them and know they're there. It's also they're a very popular animal for hunting. This is typically the kind of pens they have. This is a portable one. When they first brought them in, they tried them with 8-foot high walls. Elk went right over the top. It's hard to believe an elk inside that pen can go over the top of an 8-foot fence, but they can. And they raised them up to 9 feet, and they went over the top of that. And they finally stopped them at 10 feet when they raised the heights to 10 feet. But a 1,000-pound elk can go over a 9-foot fence inside a pen like that. On the big bulls, or bigger bulls, when they go to move them, the larger bulls, when they try and, they have to kind of put them through a narrow, like a little penstock almost type thing to get them into the truck, to get them to wherever they're going to take them to, whether it's onto a landing craft or whatever. And the elk antlers won't go through that area. It's not wide enough, so they do tranquilize them and get them into the vehicle that way, just so the elk doesn't hurt itself. That's Darrell, I believe, the second right there. But the guys from the ministry, there's a couple of them that have got permission to do that kind of work. Sorry, wrong way here. This is a release, Northern Vancouver Island, overheard. This is the type of thing that's typically the kind of truck they use. They'll use landing crafts, take them up the inlets, drop them off in all the wild and crazy places. This is part of the Rainy Chapman herd. This is down at the pulp mill. When I was down there buying some culverts off the pulp mill, just happened to bump into a few, cow and a calf. This is the area now and what it looks like. The green are basically all the recovered areas, so they've actually hit population target levels in there. They've got hunting going on in those areas. The blue areas are getting closer. And the pink areas are some of the areas that the more recent introductions in those herds are growing as well. The area up in here, Phillips Arm, is the one area that they've been concerned. They're not sure how that one's gonna work out. There was a remnant herd there from way back, but they're adding to it, and they're hopeful that they're gonna get that area, the entire area here, back into a full population. Documents attached. I'll just go into, just get out of here for a second. I just want to show you a few of the things that, if I can figure this one out now. When I mentioned so as an example, when it's going to come up. There we go. Okay. So when we do find listed species like amphibians, then we go through a process, and they were found in this particular area. So the red-legged is an S3, S4. S4 is yellow listed, S3 and S3, S4 are blue listed. I should mention elk were S3. They're now S3, S4. The plan was that they would have them to S4 and yellow listed and off the Identified Wildlife Management Strategy list by 2025. They're now expecting that that's more likely to happen by 2020, 2022, based on what's going on the lower mainland right now with the success of the herd transplant programs. So this is the kind of process that our contractors go through in terms of evaluating where they were observed, what the habitat was like, the likelihood of and looking for breeding habitat, suitable breeding habitat. We've also been doing some work with biologists on creating habitat where it didn't exist before for red-legged. That work is ongoing. We've already done one project, and we're working with biologists to do more. One of the things that we also have to do when we apply for a cutting permit is we have to do risk assessments. This is for the ministry staff, where we supply information to them that shows them what the issues, based on these factors: water quality, riparian area, fish habitat, wildlife habitat, sensitive soils, visual quality, recreational range values, cultural heritage resources, utilities for private or other properties, public health and safety, those kind of things. We have to address those and report out on those when we submit for a cutting permit. For our crews, one of the things we do in our on-site packages, there's emergency procedures, phone numbers, helicopters, companies, ambulances, aircraft. Blocks are all geo-referenced, who to contact, having designated helipads, where they can pick them up, lats and longs so that the helicopter companies can find them immediately. They don't have to go looking. They can just plug it in. We give them this information ahead of time so that they know where to come and get us. And usually we can get them there by helicopter faster than the local ambulances could come out. This is just an update. Daryl Reynolds does some work, has been doing it every year. I don't think he did it last year. It was interesting. He said he stopped it because nobody seemed to be interested. So, but this just gives you a little bit of a pictorial of when you look at our herd here, the transplant that happened in 86, 87, 24 animals, those 24 have contributed to every one of this. Is the number of animals that were transplanted to all of these locations within the Lower Mainland area. So the Powell River Forest District, the Squamish Forest District, and the Fraser Valley, the Chilliwack Forest District, the South Coast region as it's called. That's where Scott Barrett is, by the way, Mr. Mayor. He's in Surrey at the South Coast region headquarters. And when you look here, the 2015 population estimate was 1,636. So our 24 have grown into 1,636 animals in the Lower Mainland. Very healthy, very successful. Daryl's told me this is the single biggest and most successful large mammal transplant program in North America that's ever been done. Needless to say, he's pretty proud of it. And next, and that's the main reason why I believe, because this has gone so well, that we will be seeing it come off the list sooner than was initially forecast. They initially did that reevaluation in 2010 when they moved it from an S3 to an S3, S4. That next step to an S4 drops it to a yellow list. And now in our bid package that goes out, there's a number of things, but in the package itself, the wording highlighted in red, that's the way it appears. It's not, I haven't done that for this meeting. Central Coast Community Forest and the Sechelt Nation are working together cooperatively to provide more opportunities for Nation members, contractors, or subcontractors to obtain employment opportunities on forest tenures within the band's territory. As a result, bidders are expected to show and explain in their bid response how they'll work to assist the community forest in achieving this goal. This can be in the form of training opportunities, employment of phase contractor, or the main contract holder. This will be a determining factor in awarding contracts. In terms of the work that went out in our bid packages, a band contractor, again, was the winning prime contractor for the Wilson Creek work. And the contractor who won the bid in the Half Moon Bay block, a band falling contractor, is going to be doing all the falling, be it machine falling or hand falling for them in that cut block. There's an awful lot of other information in here that that we go into description of the work, falling, yarding, where the wood's going, hauling, all those kind of things, but I wanted to bring that one to your attention. And as I say, that was the same last year. The same contractor was one of the prime contractors on our on the fire block as well. The largest component of it was that band contractor, Hayden Bay Contracting. Rainfall shutdown slope stability policy. This is pretty common on the coast, and most licensees' rainfall shutdown policy is more restrictive than the ministry's. Steep slope logging, it's not steep in the sense that you traditionally would think of in the terms of, but typically if it's rubber tire machines, 35% and greater side slopes, and on track machines, 40%. Typically we don't want our machines operating on those kind of slopes, but it is something we are required to assess. It's something that we are required to mark on our maps so that the contractors know where those areas are. We have a plan before they start work on how they're going to operate in those areas. That's just all standard procedures for the kind of things that we do and the processes we go through with our contractors. When I look at the bid package or the tender package information, just go through a few things here in terms of the amount of information, because a lot of it is information we provide to them. It's not what they're coming back. So it's a matter of the forest stewardship plan, higher level plans, riparian assessments, what's out there, what was found, what the classifications are, what has to be done, visual assessments, forest health, terrain stability, wind throw assessments, whether they're required. If they are, we do them. We then make sure contractors, either the ones that we hire that or special ones, go in to do wind throw work to reduce any potential impacts if they've been identified. Archaeological assessments, harvesting, the different guidelines, things to do, soils, moisture. It's a fairly, you can see it's a 7-page document, and I believe it's actually, yeah, it is just 7, there's not more after that. Safety issues that they have to address, all requirements, seasonal shutdowns, soil sensitivity for shutdowns, site disturbance limits, equipment recommendations, reserves, how to work around them, biodiversity requirements, regen protection, pest management, wildlife requirements, riparian, roads. Anyways, you get the drift. There's an awful lot of work that goes on to it, and it's stuff that our contractors are expected to know and take responsibility for when they're out there on a day-to-day basis. And then the final one, visuals. We're required to do these on all blocks simply because the Powell River Forest District there are visual quality objectives, and there's polygons all over the place that are identified that we have to follow. And when we get into this, I'll just show you an example of what they look like. It's all computer generated in terms of how it's done. You plug in a lot of the geographical information, and then it starts generating and renders diagrams here for a number of areas here. This is, sorry, just get down into where it's starting to show some of the, where is it here? Come on. I hope it's not going to block it out somehow, because it's certainly in the document. It's not going to show it. It's interesting. Oh, there we go. So that is actually Lehigh. That's the gravel pit right here. So this is from Jenny's Way in West Porpoise Bay, looking over at our blocks in Wilson Creek. You can see Sechelt Inlet down here in Porpoise Bay. So we're higher up, further over, looking over that way. That's one of the viewpoints that we have to look at. Here's another one from Chadlich Hill, just up by the high school. Looking over at those blocks to see if they're visible and how much they're visible. You can see the landfill there. The one thing it won't pick up on this, unfortunately, is it doesn't pick up where there's houses and all that kind of stuff and trees alongside roads. And this is the same down by Snicket Park on the waterfront, looking over towards the blocks as well to see if they're visible from places where people sometimes gather and that kind of thing. So another one here from more out on Highway 101 in West Sechelt. I don't know anywhere along the waterfront in West Sechelt where you've don't have houses and trees and whatever else to block things. But nevertheless, this is obviously a worst-case scenario, but it's the kind of process we have to go through to prove to the ministry that we've met the objectives set by government for visuals. So that kind of covers off. I hope it gives you a little better understanding both of what we've done and how we've gone about it, the work that goes into it, and the work that continues to go on into it until we complete the process.
Thank you.
Oh, no?
No.
How come?
That's okay. She'll reopen it.
Thank you very much for that. And
I screwed up.
pretty thorough, so there probably aren't too many clarifying questions, but there's probably questions about some general practices and things that came up or were identified. You spent, and I appreciate in one sense, I appreciate the lengthy discussion of elk. I was spent 4 years of my life deep in the agreement in principle negotiations here in Sechelt, where Roosevelt elk seemed to never stop in terms of discussion. I thought I'd never have to hear about it again. Yeah. It was brutal discussions as they tried to figure out what the First Nations role and quantity and on that was. However, that aside, there were a couple of other environmental issues that were identified by the community in the last 3 or 4 weeks. One of them being a large white pine, and I should have asked when it was on the maps up there. But when you come across things like that in the process, are they circled or dealt with, or are they not an issue, or what? How do you deal with those kinds of
typically
things? Like you said, the veterans were all left.
Yeah,
that would be a
most of the pine are not vets. Mm-hmm. There are some that are certainly getting bigger, but basically white pine was infected with the white pine blister rust. It came in on some trees from Europe back around 1910, 1912, and by 1930, white pine in southern BC from the coast right to the Kootenays was basically wiped out by the white pine blister rust. Here in the coast, every forester I know works to try and preserve them. The issue, for example, there was a block where I had a lot of white pine in it, but there was also a significant amount of blister rust. There was an awful lot of the trees in the block. It was the highest number of white pine I've seen in an area in my career. The majority of them had already died from blister rust. And there were a very significant number of them in the stand that we harvested that were infected with it, obviously. Typically, once they get infected, 1 to 2 years, they're toast. They're done. It very quickly can girdle them. It just cuts them off, and the tree dies very quickly. I left more standing than I'd ever left before in a block. One of the things that I was not aware of, and I certainly hadn't seen anything in any of the literature that I review, typically with white pine, if you have a tall tree, you can get what we call a spike knot coming off 20 degrees off the vertical, rather than just a typical branch coming out in a normal branch type form. You get a spike knot coming off. It's quite large. It takes on almost a liter type roll. It's smaller than the main stem, but nevertheless it gets big and it keeps growing up. And there were a couple of those that I left standing, actually more than a couple, but there was out of, I don't know, probably 40 or 50 that I left standing, there was probably 8 or 10 at least that had a spike knot on them. And most of them snapped at that spike knot in the winds. We had some very strong windstorms. It was up on the top, up above the landfill, up at about 2,300 feet. And when you get southeasters and westerlies coming in, there were a number that snapped off right at the spike knot. So that's obviously a weak point in the stem. But most of them would now be where the portion below the break is still there. Those can now become wildlife trees as well. If they were live and healthy, they wouldn't be, but they can be now. But typically we do try and leave as many as we can. There were some that I took a chance on that were showing signs of infection, but it was very minor, a little bit of pitching out on the tree where you'll see pitch kind of trickling down, but not nearly as bad an infestation as where you know it's going to be toast, you hope that it might make it, and sometimes I take a chance and leave it. A number within a year were dead. They didn't make it. The rust just kept doing its thing and killed the trees. Some trees blew over, but typically we are, and there's a lot more up there that we've identified as well in adjacent stands. But yeah, it's something that we do work to preserve as many as we can. But at the same time, too, one of the good news stories is through the Ministry of Forests, through their genetics program and their seed tree programs, they're now at a point where it used to be 100%, you planned on 100% loss in white pine to blister rust. They've now been able to get it up to approximately 65% white pine resistant seed. Mm-hmm. And it's not a genetically modified seed. I want to make that very clear. You're not allowed to plant genetically modified seeds in BC on Crown land. This is just through their breeding program where they're taking trees that are showing resistance and breeding those trees together to try and breed that resistance into the seed from the resulting trees. And through that process, they've now got it up to where 65% resistance, and they expect that. So if you plant 100 seedlings, you would expect now on average you're going to get 65 that survive to full growth, whereas before you wouldn't have expected any. It's taken a long time to get there, like 40 or 50 years, but that's where they're at now. They do most of that work at the Massachi Lake Research Station on Vancouver Island.
So I just note that if the species was almost wiped out in the 1930s and there's any that are left that are getting old, then that's why the community would have a concern about those ones, not in general, but specifically in concern. Yep. So
there's a bigger one in West Sea Shelter and Half Moon Bay at Wood Bay that I'm aware of, but it.
Okay. So as long as you're aware, and concerns about
that tree is marked, by the way. If you saw the picture, there was an orange dot on it.
No.
Anyway.
If we go back, I don't look at pictures very often. Scanning my emails. I'm lucky if I get to the name.
It wasn't in my pictures. It was.
If you're generally harvesting in the 80 to 120 year range, which I saw from the very first slides, then that would mean if you do a cut now, then you're not going to be coming back to that block for 80 to 100 years.
Not necessarily. Sometimes, depending on what species are in the block, if it was more of a hemlock block, hemlock tends to come back in through natural regen, so there tends to be a little bit more of a delay sometimes before they come back. We typically, and depending on when it was harvested, they wouldn't have planted most of it. Most of it was natural regen back in that time. When it was harvested in the 40s or 50s, they weren't into planting as much back then. But typically now, one of the reasons I shifted the community forest from more of a spring, summer, fall harvesting to a fall, winter is so you get the growing season in basically. So the trees have gone into dormancy by October, November. We're harvesting after dormancy and we're planting the next spring. So there is no lost growing season. There's no regen delay. We're putting trees in the ground typically in March or April.
So if you don't come back in 80 to 100 years, you might come back in 60?
So they'll come back quicker, and we're planting better stock, A-class seed, meaning it's genetically better stock through their plus tree program that they do.
My thinking
and doing here, fertilization as well.
So. My thinking here just is that if that for whatever reason that block was left alone, you wouldn't need to come back for 60 to 80 years, because if it was cut, you're not going to come back for 60 to 80 years. So if it was left alone, it wouldn't be part of the commercial harvest for another 60 or 80 years either.
No.
No? Doesn't make sense to you?
No. The other part, if I left it for 60 or 80 years, then it's going to be getting close to old growth.
It's going to be close to 200.
Then it might not ever get harvested.
I'm just trying to figure out this. Well, that's what I'm trying to sort out here in terms of.
You could say that for every stand out there, Mr. Mayor.
Yeah.
If I didn't harvest any of them, it all become old growth or get burned or some other thing.
Well, and that's one of the things that the balance is all about is trying to balance how this works, and one of the considerations that the committee and council needs to keep in mind, because that's one of the suggestions. I'm not wanting to argue with you. I'm just trying to figure out what the results of leaving any particular stand or not would be. That's probably, maybe I'll come back to the forest district for that, because then if you do that, there's also implications, of course, in terms of your license and requirements. Can you tell us a little bit about how that works when you're working on averages of 20,000 cubic meters a year for 100 in a 5-year plan. But you've got 10,000, maybe you got 6,000 working hectares in your plans totally. If you leave a certain amount today or next year or the year after that, what does that do to your license requirements, and what does that do to your relationship with the forest district's requirements for you to do?
Okay, with the Ministry of Forests, all the tenure holders, be it woodlots or community forests or forest license holders or TFL holders, they're the kind of the four primary ones, and timber sale holders, obviously, but that's a short-term fixed through a timber sale program. But in terms of the annual allowable cut that each licensee has, be it a volume-based or an area-based tenure, we all operate on a 5-year cut control period. They don't all line up necessarily, like not every tenure in the province expires the same year. And you can roll them over so that ideally over time you'd have 20% coming up for their 5-year every year over the course of the province, or the coast and the interior, whichever way you look at it. But in terms of, it used to be in the past, if there were difficult market conditions or those kind of things, if you didn't achieve your cut, you could go to the regional manager or to the minister and ask for a cut control carryover. So the portion you didn't harvest in that 5-year period, you get to carry it over into the next 5-year in addition to your regular cut in that 5-year period, and try and make it up and get it back on track. A number of years back, I'll say in the mid-2000s, early 2000s, the ministry changed those rules and they eliminated the cut control carryover, whereby you could no longer apply to get a carryover. And part of the reason for that was the ministry was always looking for opportunities to free up volume, specifically to offer to First Nations for non-renewable forest licenses, to introduce the bands into getting involved in the forest sector. Smaller volumes, it might be, so for example, if I didn't harvest for 5 years and I had 100,000 cubic meters, they could take that 100,000, give it to the Sechelt band or one of the other bands in the district, but most likely Sechelt in this case because of the location. And the band would be offered a chance to harvest 100,000 meters, but just that 100. And I would continue to operate on the community forest. But they would have that one-time 100,000 opportunity, and it would kind of get them introduced. Now the band has been involved in the business much longer, but I just use that as an example. And so that's the process. And so most of the bands that I've worked with, be it on Vancouver Island, the mid-coast, north coast, down in the lower mainland here, hadn't been directly involved. Some had, but most hadn't. But they want to be. And so that was a way, but most of the cut has been committed to all the major licensees. When I say major, I mean small, large, whatever, but through the 10-year program, there wasn't a lot of area left that they could offer to bands. So that was the way of freeing some of that volume up. And it was a policy decision out of Victoria and applied province-wide, and it's worked quite well in that regard. And now we're seeing more volume shifting through other means, be it purchases and other things to First Nations so that their business can grow.
So do other committee members have questions? And Councillor Inkster, while we have Dave here.
Yeah, I thought the provincial representative would be here by now. It's 2:10.
Well, Nicholas.
Yeah. That would help in this discussion as well. But thanks, Dave, for doing quite an extensive discussion and presentation on not only what you do, but also the species that you're dealing with and some of the emails and concerns we received, because I did mention a couple of them to Glenn, and he replied to me when I asked about them. Could you just talk a little bit about you mentioned the scale of, you mentioned blue and yellow and things like that, and the S thing, the S definitions, obviously that's, I guess, an extinction scale in a sense, which,
It's a scale that's been created, yeah. S1 and S2 is red listed. They would be considered endangered. Blue listed are species of concern. They're S3 and S4. S3 and S3, S4. S4 is yellow listed and S5 are yellow listed. And they're the least of concern.
Oh, least of concern.
Yep. Yep.
And extirpated, did that mean hunting?
Extirpated usually means it's not, they didn't go extinct by natural, like when the dinosaurs disappeared because of climatic circumstances. Extirpated usually means either through human caused or some other very significant event. Sometimes you get very extreme back-to-back snowfalls. For example, back in 68, 69, 70, they had really heavy snowfalls on Vancouver Island, and they lost 50% of the elk herd on Vancouver Island in that period of time. That was their estimate at the time. I was living in Gold River at the time, and we had a lot of dieback in our elk herd and even more on the deer herds on the west coast of Vancouver Island because of those very, very heavy snowpacks. In one area, we had 33 feet of snowfall up at like 2,000-foot elevation over the course of the winter. And there's just no way the animals could move. Be it in the understory of a forest or other, it was just way too much snow for them to move around in. And if they got caught up there, they couldn't get out. There just wasn't enough time. So yeah, there was some serious diebacks from that. But extirpated more traditionally is more of a human caused for whatever reason. Whether it's loss of habitat, whether it's overhunting, whether it's major pollution issues that can do things. I mean, there's any one of a number of things that could contribute to it, or all of the above. Urban spread, urban sprawl, those kind of things. Some habitats are very close to that urban forest interface, and if the urban sprawl spreads, that can have a very significant impact on some species. Typically not maybe as much on a larger mammal like an elk or a deer, but smaller ones, be it frogs, some of the smaller critters that just don't have the ability to kind of get up and go. They can be impacted
Or can't
much
go
more
that
heavily.
far.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
They've got very limited range of movement, on sort of on a landscape scale.
Any other, Councillor Mueller?
Councillor Inkster's finished, I assume? Yeah.
For now, yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks for that. That was quite a technical discussion. We don't get to see that often in here, and I know I've seen you in some of the forestry roundtables and groups at UBCM, so I know that anyways that I'm very interested in this. My question was about the cut block planning, and I know you focused on EW28 today.
Yep.
You're well aware that we've received a lot of community feedback on EW28, and I'm just curious how that plays into any of your planning.
Well, I guess when I look at the feedback that I get, part of what I have to consider when I look back over time, be it here on the coast or the coast in general, not the Sunshine Coast necessarily, but I was certainly around. I've always been on the coast here when the Lower Mainland Protected Area Strategy came in 1994, 95, 96. They were the first three areas in the province that was the Chilliwack, the Squamish, and the Powell River Forest Districts were the Lower Mainland Protected Area. And they did them collectively, not individually. And they put together a table of, I believe, 15 from a variety of sectors, including Canada Parks and Wilderness, BC Wild, Rick Careless, for example. Canada Parks and Wilderness was at the table. The tourism sector was there, range was there, agriculture, mining, forestry, labor, local governments, just a wide variety of representation there from the economic sectors. And those folks sat down, that was when Mike Harcourt was the premier, the NDP brought that in along with the Forest Practices Code. And when Premier Harcourt brought that process to a head back then and got that process moving, I know when he came here to announce it, I think it was in May of 96 over at Rockwood, he and I believe it was Elizabeth Cull at the time came and announced the results. And I mean, one of Premier Harcourt's comments to everyone, including in the House, Lower Mainland Protected Area Strategy is finished. Industry now has certainty. The parks plan is done, and industry now knows where they can harvest and where they can't. Glenn Clark reiterated that comment. The Lower Mainland Protected Area Strategy is done. Ujjal Dosanjh reiterated that. Glenn Campbell reiterated it. Christy Clark has reiterated it. Whether the current government will or won't, I don't know. I'm hoping they will. I'm hoping a promise is a promise, but we'll see. So, I mean, when I look at that, it's like, do I just back off on everything because somebody wants a park? But the Lower Mainland Protected Area Strategy by all previous governments has been declared closed. It's done, and we're not naming more parks. There's certainly been a lot of pressure for it, vocal. I understand that, but I honestly don't know where it's going to end up. So, I mean, I do take it into consideration, but at the same time, there's also expectations on me to operate the tenure that the community forest here has been granted through our shareholder. I have to look at that. I have to look at the areas in question. I mean, in particular, there's about 350 hectares the community forest would lose. The Roberts Creek Study Forest would be eliminated. There's been some really good research go on up there, and there's more planned, but we would lose that entire, I'll say facility. I mean, it doesn't have any fixed infrastructure other than roads and whatever else, but the cut blocks and the work that's been done and is still ongoing to maintain that research and keep doing the measurements to update it so they know what the results are and can report out on it so that we in industry and others will understand better what the implications are of using different harvesting techniques and silviculture plans and harvesting type practices. So we would lose that. I believe I know where the Squamish Band has expressed concerns about a park, but I'll leave them to explain it. But I know they've expressed it to the regional district in the past through the OCP in West Howe Sound.
Yeah, if I could just get back to perhaps more what I was getting at is there was on one of your slides there's indicated an area of I think EW002 that you set aside. We're not logging that for now.
We logged the block.
But there was
We
a chunk
logged the
that
block.
was
There was parts that I looked at that I didn't think were appropriate. And that's why I did that as a forester. Based on my professional judgment, I decided to leave those areas out. They also happen to be, in my opinion, good ungulate range, be it deer or elk. It's good winter cover. There's good feed in the understory. It's on there is an edge on both sides, north and south. And if you look at the Ministry of Environment's elk and deer handbook, one of the things they talk about in the range zone, the 0 to 300, 0 to 400 meter range zone, they put the point forward in there very clearly that in that zone, if there is edge effect, if there is winter cover nearby, that they can get cover if they need it. There's no need to specifically set aside ungulate winter range. If they have cover and there's access to food close by, be it clear cuts and otherwise, they specifically mention that. If there's clear cuts nearby, not off in the distance somewhere, but nearby, that they can come out of cover, go get food, come back in if they choose, or just stay out. The elk here quite often go down right into the farmers' fields down in the Lower Wilson. They've actually been characterized as nuisance herds, and Daryl's shipped them out of there a few times. But
so I think what my question I was trying to get at was, and I think if I could just paraphrase what you said, there's a high-level agreement, and you're operating in every area of your cut block or your tenure, regardless of community, I guess, needs or expressions. And you exercise your judgment as a forester, and that's the prime objective.
I wouldn't say it's the prime. I think what I do is I try and take into account the feedback I get, but at the same time, I also have to put a lens on it is how realistic is it? If I'm told that's critical ungulate winter range, it must be protected. And I have advice that it's not. And I mean, I do, I think, have a reasonable understanding of ungulate winter range, as well as other species, be it mountain goat habitat, be it marbled murrelet habitat, be it a variety of other habitats for listed species. But if the people expressing the opinions that it's critical ungulate winter range isn't backed up by the science that is out there that we're asked to reference and refer to and use in making professional judgments, then I can't put as much weight on that opinion or request than if the science did support it. So I can't just blindly follow comments as a forester and say, oh, somebody expressed a criticism or a concern, I've got to stop. I
No,
gotta go
yeah,
over
no,
here
and
now.
that
It's-
wasn't.
I've got to rationalize it and
That-
look at it and make a judgment call. And in some cases, I will do things, and in other cases, I won't. We work with a variety of groups and people and individuals, be it the Trails Society and all of their member groups or others, but we do take a lot of comments in, and there's an awful lot of people come walking through our door at the office, just picking up a firewood permit, want to talk and ask about something. There's
I think we'll move on
Yep,
to some other
sure.
questions or some more that Councillor Mueller has. What I'm hearing is similar to the question I asked about the plan, and it was good to see it on the map, to see what you were leaving and what you weren't leaving, where the riparian areas are, but that can be presented in ways which say these meet a number of the concerns the community has, or it can be presented as these are purely technical forestry decisions that I made in the for whatever reasons. And I think the Councillor Mueller was giving you an opportunity to show how various parts that are left that meet forestry needs also meet community needs. And so that presentation approach is something we're going to have to work on. So we can, because we have to go to the community as well. And we're not technical, so we've got the technical background. We see that. We appreciate that out of the 27 hectares, you're going to cut 19 and leave 7. We need a better understanding of what that remaining parts are so that we can stand at the street corner and in the grocery store and whatever and say, look, this riparian zone is protected in this way. That block is left so it's contiguous with the old growth management area. Those are all things that we're trying to get at beyond your forestry technical approach. So that's why the questions are coming in this way. It's not because we want to get into arguments about any particular species or elk or whatever. We got a good letter from the district that explained where that stood, so everyone knows that. So that argument's been done. What we're trying to be able to do is talk to our community directly about the values that they have and show that they're actually shared by the forestry or not, if they're not, and how the land protection and parks area that Harcourt put in place is or is not sufficient. So that's sort of where Councillor Mueller was trying to get at. Is there any other comments just in terms of where we're at here? And then we'll try and move on to the Forest District. I got a note from Nicholas. He's not going to be here at all. And then I want to say a few words from that microphone about the process that Nicholas and I went through in reviewing this. Councillor Lutz.
When you talked about leaving a fair number of white pine because they are old and healthy,
Not old per se.
but healthy.
Yeah. I try and leave as many healthy ones. Yeah, if they're healthy, I'm leaving them.
So do you then inform the researchers so they can gather for the genetics of those trees?
I've talked to people at Missachi Lake at the Ministry of Forest Research Station there, and they're continuing to do work on, because we do seem to have a significant number here that I'll say they appear to be blister rust resistant, and I have talked to them about the idea of them collecting seed over here. I'm not sure if they have, but I know they're aware of it. The researcher that I did talk to, who's one of the senior people there, we have talked about, and I'd like to get him actually over here to, I met him in Lake Cowichan there 2 years ago, but he hasn't come over yet, but I do plan on having him over.
And your presence as workers in the forest have
Sorry, the which?
some
I'm sorry?
the forest.
Okay.
The workers have some input into what they see each day as far as some of these species at risk and for fire control and those sorts of things.
No, they're certainly aware of them, and they're required to let me know if they find, like if they saw a red-legged frog, they're required to call me and let me know. Yeah.
Any further comments while Dave's here? people are thinking a little bit. Do you mind if you step back and we hear
Yep,
from the
no
Forest District for a few minutes? I want to thank you very much for that. I found it informative. I would have, and I think there's lots we can work with in terms of what was presented and stuff. Do you want to introduce yourself in a sense of what an operations manager does compared to the Derek?
Sure. And firstly, Derek sends his regrets. He wishes he could have been here, but obviously it was short notice, and he was committed otherwise, so he voluntold me to be here, and I'm happy to be here, of course. And as I'm the resource manager now, is what they call it. It's been known for a long time as operations manager. So in this district, the Sunshine Coast Natural Resource District, there's a district manager and a resource manager. Many districts have 3 managers. And I look after, as much as possible, all the operational aspects for all the forestry tenures that Dave touched on, a lot of them: tree farm licenses, forest licenses, woodlot, forest, community forests, that kind of stuff. Just making sure all the various authorizations, land authorizations, permitting processes are all being done according to policy and legislation and any other statutory requirements. And obviously responding and being available as needed to the public and local government. So the questions that were sort of put to me yesterday that I think you were hoping to get some information on was, what are some potential considerations, implications with respect to cutting permits, specifically the tenure for the community forest as a whole, and even for the cut control period that Dave spoke to, and even beyond that. What are the implications if areas are set aside or not harvested, or the full volume is not harvested of the AAC? So I'll just touch briefly on that. And those are the things, that's all I really came prepared to speak to. But if there's other questions beyond that, I'm happy to try and touch on them, or at least get some answers for you if I can't answer them today.
I understand you have a close personal connection to local government, so you might help us bridge that gap.
I do, so it's interesting to be sitting in the gallery as opposed to up there. So I've got some appreciation for what you're going through and what you spoke to when you referred to the grocery store or the street corner. Very familiar with that and those conversations. However, starting with at the cutting permit level, so Dave mentioned the cutting permit for these 3 blocks in particular was issued about a year ago now, and it was for a 4-year term. So there's 3 years remaining in the term for that cutting permit specifically. Now, as I understand it, the question was, okay, what happens if the harvesting starts on some of that and some of it is set aside and it's not all logged, right? So the quick and short answer to that is, once a cutting permit is done, there's an assessment done at the end of it. Anything that hasn't been harvested or is deemed to be waste or residue that's left behind, and that could include areas that are standing and not harvested and deferred because there's authorization for the entire volume that was applied for to be harvested, that is assessed stumpage regardless of whether it was harvested or not. So
you pay for that?
You pay for that. You pay for whatever's left standing. So granted, the stumpage for community forest is lower than other tenures, but you're also forfeiting the potential benefit of the net return on the having auctioned it, and the revenue that the dividend that the shareholder would accrue from that. So that's specific to the cutting permit itself. In terms of the cut control period over the 5-year period that Mr. Lasser referred to, he's quite right. There was a policy change a while ago for very good reasons, obviously. The province was looking to make volume available for First Nations in particular, and other communities, even for community forests and such. So if there was an undercut at the end of the 5-year period, say the volume harvested was just the 60,000 and there was 40,000 left at the end of 5 years, Sechelt Community Forest wouldn't be able to carry that over. That would then be made available in all likelihood as a direct award to a First Nation. And secondly, if not to a First Nation, it would be made available through competitive process to anyone else that might want that volume. And there's good reasons for that. There's good reasons for having cut control in when it was first brought in. It was to allow for some flexibility in markets and varying the volume from year to year. They didn't want to stick with a set, so many meters per year. They wanted to allow, province wanted to allow flexibility in how much volume, but at the same time wanted to ensure volume was harvested to ensure there was a sustainable level of cut in the forest sector and in industry. But just know that the volume in all likelihood would be made available to First Nations, because First Nations in this district in particular have made it quite clear that they're interested in more volume. The third question, as I understand it, that you might be interested in was, what happens if we just step away almost entirely, we don't continue with community forest? I mean, there's all kinds of potential implications there. It's not just a simple black or white answer at this stage. I really doubt that the province would quickly move to pull the license away or terminate it, right? There's all kinds of things that would have to happen first, and discussions. So really, I think that's an unlikely scenario that you don't really need to be concerned about.
It's too hypothetical.
I would say so, yes. Okay. But I would say that given there are other local governments and people that are quite interested in volume, I suspect they would be making a case for having access to any volume that maybe wasn't being harvested or managed. Mm-hmm. So a number of things for you to consider. Obviously, being the sole shareholder of the community forest, that's something for District Sechelt to consider.
The other, and it was actually a side comment between Derek and yourself and in the emails, was as operations manager, of course, you have a pretty good window on forest practices in the entire district. And your comments about the work of the community forest were very positive, and that might be useful for the committee to hear as well. Yeah, certainly. There's a high degree of confidence in the work that your community forest is doing, and the professionals that, not just Mr. Lasser himself, but the professionals that are working for the community forest. There's no concerns that we have, Derek or myself, regarding the work that's being done and the emphasis on various professional assessments that are required, at the legislative regulatory requirement level, but also at the professional level as well. So there's nothing that concerns us at that level, and you got a sense of it with just the nature of the background assessments and documents that Dave presented you here today. While you're here, committee members, Councillor Mueller, and I see Councillor Inkster as well.
Yeah, I had a question about the cut control period and the 4-year term. Now, both of those, are those site specific, and at what point in the process do they become site specific?
So the cut control period is 5 years, as I understand it, for this community forest.
Anything coming out of that wasn't logged, would that be tied to a particular area, or is it just?
Oh, it would come from that area of the community forest. So if it was $40,000 that was undercut, that would be made available either through a particular block or a portion of the community forest. Again, a lot of hypotheticals there. Somehow it would have to be made available, probably direct award or competitive process afterwards.
So out of the tenure?
Yes.
And out of the blocks that were approved?
Not necessarily. It could come from elsewhere.
Okay. And then that 4-year term, those are tied to the approved blocks. Is that right? Or how does that? Yes,
correct. So the 4-year term, the 3 blocks that are under cutting permit 9, I think it is, that expires in 3 years. At the end of that 3 years from now, whatever's not harvested, there'll be a waste survey, it's called. Bit of a misnomer, because usually that's focused on what's left behind on the ground, and there's charges for whatever's left there. But if there's standing volume that was intended to be harvested that's also left, there's a charge on that as well.
So once the license has been issued, the harvesting license, then it's now area-based, and it has to be done in that area.
Once harvesting actually starts on that cutting permit. So if harvesting is in fact started on any one of the blocks, then you're locked in for whatever's remaining. You're on the hook for stumpage for the entire volume.
Thank you.
And as we go to Councillor Inkster, I'll just remind people that this is a well-engineered wood-framed building with laminate, and we can take all sorts of stuff because it's made from a good renewable product. Councillor Inkster, I thought I saw first, but Councillor Seegers, if you'd like to go ahead, your microphone's on.
Sure. Thank you. So I don't understand how the process works. Does the community forest determine which of the areas they would like to log and then apply for the cut permit for those areas, or how does that kind of play out?
Yes, so the community forest and their managers are responsible for all that engineering, the assessments, all the work that goes into those particular blocks. They decide where they're going to be located, how they're going to be engineered or developed, and then put into a package, submitted for authorization, and that goes through a process from the ministry's perspective of, okay, does it meet all of regulatory requirements? Is it consistent with their plans? And then approvals given. So that happened a year ago now. So they've already been approved for that cutting permit, those 3 blocks.
Okay, and in those 3 blocks, they determine how much they're intending to cut from each of the areas? So they're going to say,
Yes.
we're taking so much volume from this area, so much from
Correct,
this area,
correct.
et cetera.
Yeah.
And then if they don't, they still pay a fee for every tree or stumpage fee that they did not take.
Right. If it was intended to be harvested,
Yes.
if it's left behind, they have to pay the stumpage on it. Any tenure holder has to pay the stumpage on what's left behind.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Councillor Inkster.
Thank you. I know, Russell, you have a unique perspective on these issues that we're seeing today, and especially you. I mean, I know you guys are in the thick of a sewage treatment issue as well right now, so that's Sechelt issue as well. In terms of the forestry issues, and I know that your council has a slightly different relationship with the community forest than we do in terms of dividends discussions and things like that, but do you see, there's a reason why you're here today with the community forest, because we've received some concerns over a particular plan. Do you see those kinds of things in your area with species question and species at risk discussions in Paul River, or?
Similar questions, similar discussions, but we're structured not that differently. Powell River's Community Forest is governed, it's a separate corporation, if you will, where the city of Powell River is the sole shareholder, but the day-to-day operations and the management of that community forest is left to the Community Forest Board. We don't get into the kitchen, the local government doesn't get into the kitchen. We've all heard this as councillors. We stick with the strategic higher level discussions. The only point at which we get involved is the final approval on spending of the dividends for grant applications. And I note that the structure seems similar for your Sechelt Community Forest. So there hasn't been a lot of that interaction on block level, site specific level, species at risk specific discussions. I think in large part because there's great confidence on the part of the community in how the community forest has been managed, and probably in part because there's been quite a few projects funded through the community forest now over the last 9-10 years. I think we're up to $8.5 million of community projects funded by our community forest up there.
Follow up.
Yeah, thanks for giving us a view of what I think many of us know about how similar you are. I always wonder, just to open question to council via the chair, as if the community forest a number of years ago would have had cooperation and/or agreement from the other regional district areas on the Sunshine Coast, if it was a Sunshine Coast operation, because they were asked a number of times if there would be a lessening of some of these tensions, because it's a DOS license and there's other areas that are outside the plan. So just throwing that out there. Thanks.
Thank you, and I am trying to watch the time a bit here too. Councillor Wright.
First of all, thank you for your presentation, and to Mr. Lassiter as well. We're getting a lot of correspondence about EW28. That seems to be the one that's at issue. Is it safe to say that if we didn't do a cut on EW28, and the tenure expired, that would then revert to somebody else and would very likely get cut anyway?
It's a bit of a hypothetical. I mean, the only thing for certain, if some harvesting has already started on some of the other blocks under that cutting permit, stumpage would be paid after the term expired. But the other question relates more to what the status would be for the community forest at the end of the cut control period. Mm-hmm. So the community forest very well could still cut the 100,000 meters of AAC at the end of 5 years, and that wouldn't be an implication. If there was an undercut and the province decided to make that volume available to someone else, yes, there's a good chance that same block or volume elsewhere from that tenure would get cut regardless.
Thank you.
Okay, I think other than the fact that it's raised a couple more questions, we probably should just thank those guests. I think it's probably time for me to go and act as a delegate to give a little bit of a reporting on what Nicholas and I had in our discussions with the chief. And then I also wanted to put up a map so people could see the context for the Roberts Creek proposed park OCP area. And if we can do that, that's just for context, but we'll start there, and I'll let Councillor Lutz
I'd like to remind the delegate okay.
If you don't ask any questions, it'll be less than 5 minutes. I just wanted to start for context so we could get a sense. The large area outlined is Area D in the regional district, which is the Roberts Creek electoral area, and the representative elected director is sitting behind me, a couple of rows behind, Director LaBelle. So that's the area that's represented. We often talk about the OCP and the park itself as a proposal and not being part of the OCP. And what I wanted just this for reference for two things. One, so people could see where the park is located, and the park is in the dark green that stretches down with the cross hatching across. And what I'll call the traditional OCP is identified from the colored grading of the other properties. You'll see the yellow density around where the village of Roberts Creek is, and brown is more rural, and green areas are parks. Up in the top left-hand corner is the solid waste site. It's an industrial zone in that area. So that's what that is. But basically and committee members are fully aware of the role of the OCP in setting future conditions and potential for when there's a change of use in land and when things move forward. So just so you can see both the size of the park, the location of it vis-a-vis the residential area, and the OCP proper with the planned designations in colored zoning, the lighter brown being rural, darker brown being a slightly higher density, and the yellow being the highest density. What I really wanted to say was, with Nicholas not being here, Nicholas Simons, our MLA, and others have done a lot of work in the last 3 or 4 weeks to take seriously the concerns raised by members of the community and by the media in editorials and other ways to take a rational approach and see what really could be done here. I won't put words into anyone's mouth, especially, but Nicholas Simons, who actually had got special permission this morning to leave a caucus meeting, their last caucus meeting of the year and the end of the legislative one, so he could be here. Unfortunately, it's been delayed by fog and rain and things of that nature. But he did meet with both the Ministry of Environment and the Minister of Forest Lands, Natural Resources Operations, and reported that and talked to me in some length about that conversation. And he also set up a formal three-way call between myself and Chief Paul of the Sechelt, and we talked about the same issues. When our MLA met with the ministers, there was a very clear understanding of continuing social problems on the coast vis-a-vis the cut, and a need for instituting some higher level of planning, because as much as the 1996-97 protection plans put in place, the Sunshine Coast has always felt that it was the part of the one forest district that didn't have the same response as Powell River, Chilliwack, and the Squamish-Lillooet districts. And so my understanding is there is a commitment from the provincial government to move towards putting some planning processes in place that will help us have a table to talk about some of these things, which led directly to the question posed by some in the community, but posed directly by Nicholas and myself and the chief to ourselves and to others. Is there any, what is the value of a delay or requesting a delay? Could the ministry request a delay? Could the shareholder request a delay? And to what avail? And there was no, again, not putting words in anyone's mouth, but there was no uptake of that notion from the ministry at the ministerial level in the province. It reverts to the kind of discussions we had here. Well, if it's not logged in this cut, it will be put forward for others sooner rather than later, but at some point it's considered by the minister as part of the working forest, and a delay would not really have the effect that we have in mind. Because it does raise the question, if you're putting a planning process in place, what do you do while you're talking? You don't want to necessarily take away what you're trying to talk about. In the three-way call with Chief Paul, Nicholas Simons, and myself, we wanted to explore where I needed to know two things: where the band was in terms of a potential delay or pause in this, and whether they supported the plans, the 5-year plans, and the cut itself. And as this committee knows, and most of the public knows, we look for guidance on natural land and resource issues within the Sechelt territory to the Sechels themselves. And that's been a pretty strong statement since our inaugural meeting on. And it was made clear in that conversation that the chief basically said, it's a good time for a call. I've got the briefing papers with me now. I met with my council this afternoon, and I've been meeting with the elders. And from that context, he proceeded to say that they understood what the cut was about and supported it, and there was no change in their initial support of the referral that came through in terms of that. And I think that's important for us to know. The second part then was, okay, you're in support of that. What if there was a delay or a departure? And his comments there, the chief's comments, well, we're interested in some of those blocks as well. And that speaks to what we just heard from the Forest District, that if, in fact, the community forest releases or somehow doesn't move into those areas, the band is ready to and anxious to. They're currently in long-term negotiations with the province on what they're calling the foundation agreement, which is another version of reconciliation agreement and something other than a treaty. And it's clear that in that foundation agreement, they're discussing resource sharing and accommodation that comes and flows from the use of the land there. But in all of those discussions, there was no hint to me that it wasn't about the exploitation of the resource in its current forms. And so then I was left talking to, if the shareholder felt that, given that there was a provincial process and there was a First Nations process, we were left totally on our own with absolutely nothing to stand on. If we in fact called for a second look from the community forest, it would simply lead to either the province or the Sechelles stepping into that vacuum. And that was part of the email that I sent to you. But I thought I should make that public so that people would know two things: that a number of people did give this a lot of consideration and try and see what the options were. And our MLA in particular, it worked overtime. It's quite amazing. He did an awful lot of work, and I really wish he had been able to get here, because he did try and get out of a caucus meeting, which is probably like getting out of a council meeting, something you like to do, but you don't often do. So if there's any questions about our work and discussions, that would be the time to do.
Councillor Inkster.
Yeah, thank you. And of course, this is information you provided to us previously as well, but it's a good opportunity to let the public know what you found. And in what you've just said to us and the people here, just to make just some clarification, one is that you would say the Sechelt would probably go in there and harvest, is what you said, if we didn't. And I heard from you in saying in discussions with the province that they're comfortable with how this is moving along and comfortable with the plans of the community forest.
Obviously, the Minister of Environment and Parks was more open to consideration of changes and differences, and the Minister of Forests, it's my understanding, is quite comfortable with the process in place and the importance of a working forest and it continuing, and no interest whatsoever in I think we heard earlier that different premiers have reiterated support for the protected lower mainland protected areas strategy, and I think that would probably continue from what I heard, but I don't want to speak for that. The more important part, though, was there was a willingness on both to understand that we need planning, we need better planning on these areas. We need to have a planning process, which we've lacked. Some of you might know we tried in the late 90s. Lee Turnbull was actually a facilitator hired to do that for years. And this park proposal, it was Adrian Belshaw, director from Roberts Creek and chair of the Sunshine Coast Regional District, who first formally put that out on the table. So people have been working for some time, and I think we need to think about why that is yet to be conclusive or productive.
Any further questions?
Thank you. So does our committee have anything more they'd like to discuss? Got a lot to come through. The only thing that we don't know, and again, it comes back to being in the kitchen or not in the kitchen and whether we're looking at operations or not, and we haven't been, and I think we've been pretty good about staying away from that. But there's always a question of why this area at this time or at this place, because you've got 6,000 working hectares to work with, and we know you're rotating around, and we'll probably never know the answers for that. But I know that was the one question that came up when Councillor Seegers was posing her sense. Then it comes down to, okay, well, why any specific one? And that's, I guess, something that takes place in operations. If there's nothing else here, and yes, Mark, if you'd like to say a few words.
I'm late for a meeting.
Yeah. Okay.
I just wanted to thank Mayor and Council for participating in their efforts on this issue. And it's great to hear the potential of a higher level land use piece. Folks on the coast. And I want to thank the presenters for
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. That's true. You have been commenting, and it's effective. With that, I would look to formally adjourn the meeting, but then open it up to members of the public who have been listening. Councillor Inkster, adjourn. Seconded by Councillor Seegers. All those in favor? Thanks. And there's been some patient people, both meeting